Our guest on This is America and the World is Ambassador Román Macaya. The ambassador serves as the Republic of Costa Rica's ambassador to the United States. The ambassador is a renowned scientist in the fields of biotechnology and biomedical research and holds a doctorate in biochemistry from UCLA and a master's degree in healthcare management from the Wharton School of Business. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Dennis. It's a pleasure to be here on your program, and I really thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, thank you. I fabricate the first question in a kind of a strange way. I'll let you run with it. No Army, Costa Rica, no Army, no hunting, and almost no smoking. How did that all come about? I mean, that is a tremendous legacy, I think.
Well,
could you put all those together?
Yeah, that's a trick question, but I'll approach all three of them. We have an unusual history, and we ended up in a somewhat of a different reality today than a lot of our neighbors, and that's due to our history. We bet hard and decidedly on education early on in our nation's history. Back in 1869, we made education mandatory, free, and paid for by the state for both boys and girls, which was very progressive. I mean, making education universal was already progressive, and to make it universal for both boys and girls was doubly progressive. So if you think about our country back in those years, we were a coffee growing and coffee exporting nation. But this policy meant that the son of a coffee farm owner had the same education as the daughter of a peasant on that coffee farm. So it started to create a more equal society. And that has sort of been the characteristic of Costa Rica, is having a strong middle class, and we're very uncomfortable with the extremes. Now, you mentioned no Army. That you'd have to fast forward up to 1948. But before I get there, the 40s were a very decisive period in our history. And there was a lot of things going on. There was a lot of political turmoil. We, in 1941, reached some pretty major decisions and agreements. There was an agreement to create what is today called the social guarantees. And that was the labor code, which established the minimum wage, the 40-hour work week, workers' compensation. It established, at the same time, the University of Costa Rica. So this was continuing on with that bet on education, but now it was higher education. The University of Costa Rica is still one of our principal universities. It's a public institution, it's very highly regarded, and it's almost free. And then we established our universal healthcare system. Back then it wasn't universal, it was a healthcare system that was designed to cover the healthcare needs of workers. Later it was expanded to include workers' families, then it was expanded to include the unemployed, and later it was expanded to include the poor, and later legal immigrants, and then beyond that, even undocumented immigrants, if they were women or children, and so forth. And today it's pretty close to universal healthcare coverage. This was an agreement that was reached in a very politically charged decade. Now, in 1948, we had a brief but very influential civil war. All civil wars are influential, as you can imagine. And the person who sort of led the victorious side of that brief civil war, as soon as the war was over, abolished the Army as a permanent institution. And since then, we've lived with no Army. So that explains the first part of that trilogy that you mentioned. The other two are more recent. The why no hunting, well, that was a recent law that, you know, we wanted to, and it has to do, once again, with our history, in that we bet pretty strongly on conservation. and I'll get into conservation whenever you want to touch that subject, but it has to do with renewable energy, with the conservation of as much of our biodiversity as possible. And this was part of that effort. It was a more recent law that essentially banned all forms of hunting. And then the no smoking has to do with that public health institution from 1941. Health is a right in Costa Rica. It's actually in our Constitution. Every citizen has a right to health care.
Wow.
And but we have to take some responsibility. And so we've been pushing to eliminate smoking as one of the causes of morbidity in our society.
But it's almost like no smoking almost everywhere.
Well, there is some smoking
I'm sure.
allowed.
Yeah, there
but
is.
There's a lot of places where you cannot smoke.
But life expectancy in Costa Rica is higher than in the United States, isn't it? Yeah,
it's slightly higher.
Yeah.
And also the difference between men and women is more narrow. So men tend to live less than women in many parts of the world. Costa Rica is the same case, but it's the gap is a little more narrow.
Happy Planet Index. A couple of times in the last few years, it's been #1,
including last year.
Including last year.
Yes. Well, I'm getting confused with the dates here. Yeah. Including 2014.
14 and previous to that. There is a greeting that people use coming and going, which says "Good life."
Pura vida.
Yeah, I wasn't going to try to try it there.
Pura vida literally means pure life.
Pure life,
and it means a healthy life, a good life, an enjoyable life, a fulfilling life, and it means you're well, and that's what you wish someone when you say pura vida. But we use it so much it punctuates our sentences.
So it's a greeting, it's a goodbye.
It could be. You're right. It could be a greeting.
It's
it
a
can be a goodbye.
salutation. Yes.
It's a salutation.
Excellent.
But it's an expression of wellness to the other person.
Wow. Let's take a little break. Tell the folks at home that we're talking with the ambassador from the Republic of Costa Rica. I hope I do justice to the pronunciation.
Yes.
Román, is that right? Román Macaya.
Yes.
And there is so much to learn about this fabulous country, a real success story on many levels, and you'll be fascinated to know as we talk about conservation that the ambassador mentioned, in environment, biodiversity, 840 species of birds there. Amazing. Sit tight, back on the other side. This is America and the World. This is America and the World is brought to you by the National Education Association, the U.S.-China Education Trust, and F.Y. Chang Foundation, guided by Ambassador Julia Chang Block, President. The League of Arab States, representing 350 million people in 22 member countries. Japan, history, hospitality, and advanced technology. Sharing tomorrow. Tourism, Malaysia. The Petroleum Group, expertise with integrity in the fields of oil and gas, exploration and production, energy, and infrastructure. The Rotondaro Family Trust. The Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings. And Ventana Productions, television facilities, editing, and distribution services. What's the population of Costa Rica?
It's about 4.8 million.
And how about urban, rural? How does it work out?
We're slightly, obviously, as most countries in the world, we're becoming a more and more urban population. We're slightly more urban than rural now. That happened a few years ago when we had more people living in cities. But we still have a fair number of people, over 40% in the rural areas.
You mentioned that in the early days it was agriculture and coffee, right?
Yes.
But you know, historically, you got Spain involved from way back. But Columbus kind of walked on by there or sailed
Yes,
on by, didn't he?
yes.
At one particular point?
Yes.
In the
well,
1500s?
there was a pre-Columbian history. We have some of our heritage comes from pre-Columbian history. With we didn't have very large indigenous populations, but there was a population or several. And one of the things that they left us was these spheres. They're these stone spheres, and they can go anywhere from the size of a soccer ball all the way to about 2.5 meters in diameter. These are stones that are carved into a near perfect sphere, and we don't know how they did this nor why they did this, but their position seems to be important, and they are found in some very unusual places. For example, we have an island off the southern Pacific coast of Costa Rica called Isla del Caño, Caño Island. And a lot of the stones, these stone spheres, were found there, despite the fact that those stones were not found on the island. So they were brought out to this island.
Wow.
And we have spheres in the south peninsula of the Osa Peninsula, or around this area. Some of them are very large. They were discovered in the 1930s when they were clearing some fields to grow bananas, and they started digging up these perfect spheres made out of stone.
Where do they think they come from, and is there anything like it in other countries in the area?
Well, I'm not aware of these being present in any other country, and they're a part of our heritage now.
And again, the sizes?
They can go from the size of a soccer ball all the way to about 2.5 meters in diameter.
And they may be placed in different...
Their location may be important. We don't know.
Wow.
They may have to do with celestial bodies. They may have to do with a representation of the power that, or the hierarchy in society that certain people had. We really don't know much about, once again, why they made these spheres or how they made them. Because the tools from back then, if you can imagine, how did you make a perfect sphere that big?
Wow.
And so...
Spain and Mexico have their war, and out of it is the beginnings of independence for Costa Rica. How did that work out?
Well, Costa Rica really didn't fight for its independence. We requested our independence, and not just as Costa Rica, but as Central America. And independence was granted to all 5 Central American countries, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, simultaneously on September 15th of 1821. And then we had a discussion amongst us as to whether we should stick together because we were a federation of colonies back then, or if we should go our own ways. And in the end, we decided to go our own ways. Now, Costa Rica, this was not an easy decision back in 1821. We were very poor. We had a very small population. And we really didn't know if we could make it alone. And once we decided to go that route, we started, once again, betting on education. We later bet on healthcare. And more recently, we've bet on conservation, on diversifying our economy to more high-tech products and services. And we can get into that. And it has served us very well, but when these decisions were being made, it wasn't an obvious decision. In retrospect, hindsight is 20/20. But today, we know that most of those decisions were good decisions, but they weren't easy decisions when they were made.
I was thinking about a governor back in the 1700s. One of the Spanish governors said that Costa Rica was the poorest, most miserable colony in all of the Americas. And I'm saying, and Costa Rica, the translation is rich.
Rich coast.
Rich coast.
They thought we had lots of gold, and we didn't.
It didn't, huh?
No, we didn't.
But the economy in the beginning was coffee. It was agriculture. How did this American get involved in building a railroad there?
Minor Keith?
Yeah.
Well, he was brought in to build a railroad. The economy in the Central Valley was based primarily on coffee. And then we had the banana production on the Atlantic coast. And Minor Keith was involved in building the railroad and what was called the Northern Railroad Company.
So that was just to move the coffee to the coast, I guess.
Yes, for export,
yeah,
and also just for transporting cargo. And the banana plantations were run primarily by what was then United Fruit Company. And they had a different structure. That was a big corporation that was in the banana production. Whereas the coffee business was a completely different culture. In the coffee business, it was mostly small landowners that had got into coffee. One of our presidents, Braulio Carrillo, at the time, in the 1800s, was one of the promoters that we should get into the coffee business and started handing out coffee seeds, but also if you grew the coffee bean, you could have access to land. And so it created a more sort of equal society of proprietors, of people who owned their land.
So what is the coffee is still important today? What's the economy driving the economy today?
Well, that's a very good question. It's something that most people don't know. If you ask anyone on the street, what is Costa Rica's #1 export? A lot of people would guess coffee, which is an important export. It's part of our history. It's part of, you can't separate coffee from our history. It is an integral part of it. Bananas is another big export. But our #1 export overall is services. And it's not just tourism, but corporate, what they call shared services. These are corporate operations from global networks of corporations that have, it could be accounting services, financial analysis, it can be engineering, design. They're pretty sophisticated services, and they set up operations in Costa Rica not to service the local economy, but to service the global economy. And that has been a sweet spot in our economy. It's a booming sector. And as far as products that you can touch and feel, our #1 export today is medical devices. So we produce anything from pacemakers to catheters, surgical instruments. We have about 70 medical device companies based in Costa Rica, mostly in manufacturing of these devices for export.
How did that happen?
Once again, bet on education. So we had a workforce that was educated, that was very productive, that was young, that was healthy, and companies started looking at Costa Rica. We had what I would call an Intel moment back in 1998 when Intel, the chip manufacturer, decided to build a chip manufacturing plant in Costa Rica. And that put Costa Rica on the map for high-tech manufacturing. They thought, if Intel decides that Costa Rica is a great place to manufacture computer chips, then it must be a good place for other types of high-tech manufacturing. And that has started to attract other industries, and the medical device field really has blossomed. I mean, they have found that the Costa Rican worker is very engaged, that's very productive, very willing to contribute to the goals of the company beyond what was expected when he or she was hired.
Is the predominant language Spanish?
The predominant language is Spanish, but more and more people speak English. Now today, Intel has consolidated their operations. They are no longer manufacturing chips in Costa Rica, but they have changed their footprint in Costa Rica. Now Intel is designing its computer chips in Costa Rica. So we changed from manufacturing to actually creating, to designing, to R&D. And that's our big push now, is to get more value added out of our workforce, to have people create things rather than simply manufacturing them.
We would be I would be remiss if we didn't get on the table ecotourism, the environment, the attention that Costa Rica pays to the environment, very progressive policies. You mentioned energy earlier. Talk a little bit about a tax on water pollution, a goal of being carbon neutral in just a few years.
In 6 years?
Yeah.
Well, now 5 years.
5 years. 2021, yeah.
2021, yes. We have a stated goal to become carbon neutral by 2021. Now, some people might think, well, that's pretty ambitious. How realistic is it? Well, if you look at where carbon is emitted in an economy, usually there is power generation, electrical generation. You have the manufacturing industrial base, and then you have transportation. So let's look at those three areas. In power generation, we have been betting on renewable energies for many decades. We just finished 2015 generating 99% of our total electrical generation from renewable resources, specifically 98.95%. So only 1.05% came from fossil fuels. That is primarily hydroelectric, which is about 70%. Another 15% is geothermal from our volcanoes. We've got the remainder primarily from wind. We have a lot of windmills that generate electricity as well, and a little bit of biomass and solar. And then there's just that remainder of about 1% of fossil fuels. So there we're doing well. In our economy, our industrial base is mostly high-tech manufacturing. We've got agriculture. And so you don't burn a lot of fossil fuel producing medical devices or these other products. So it really comes down to transportation. That's where we've got to focus now, that we have to electrify transportation in order to start moving our entire country away from crude oil. And that's not going to happen by 2021 because the goal of becoming carbon neutral also involves compensation. So once again, it has to do with conservation, with forests that capture carbon. And let's talk about that. We, back in the 60s, were basically pushing exports on agricultural commodities. And there was a lot of clear cutting of forests to produce grasslands for cattle or for other crops. We were losing forests. And we decided we've got to do something to save the forests that are left. So we came to the U.S., we studied the national park system of the U.S., and we implemented something very similar in Costa Rica and started building national parks, quickly ramped up to about 1/3 of our territory being protected by national parks. Now, what was outside of national parks was still being clear cut. So we were ending up with islands of forests. We had to increase our forest coverage. And that meant getting private landowners to enter the conservation area. So we created a carbon tax that creates funds for landowners that leave their land idle for conservation. And what happened is amazing. Between 1986 and 2012, we almost doubled our population. We tripled our GDP per capita. And at the same time, we went from 21% forest coverage to 52% forest coverage. We're the only tropical country that has reversed deforestation.
We're at the end of our time, but we want to say that Costa Rica is so well visited, especially by tourists from the United States, looking for everything from the animals to the plants to the forests to the beaches to the birds. Ecotourism is huge, isn't it?
It is. People come down to see our natural wonders. We are the most biodiverse country on the planet on a square kilometer basis. In other words, there are more other countries that have more species of plants and animals than Costa Rica. But for the landmass that we have more per square meter or square kilometer than any other country in the world. You mentioned birds. The entire eastern coast of the U.S., the entire eastern seaboard, has one species of hummingbird. And I'm just giving this as an example. Costa Rica, smaller than West Virginia, has 52 species of hummingbirds. So when you go visit Costa Rica, you see the biodiversity. You see the birds, you see the animals, you see the plants, and you see it very quickly with a short drive, you end up in different ecosystems. And this is this is the gold that the Spaniards were looking for back when they arrived and called us rich coast. But it wasn't gold, it's biodiversity.
Ambassador, we are at the end of our time. So much more to talk about. I know your roots here in the United States, your mom, your schooling, your working here. Thrilled for the education about Costa Rica. And we thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For information about This Is America and the World and to watch all of our programs, visit our website, thisisamerica.net, and look for us on Facebook and Twitter. This Is America and the World is brought to you by the National Education Association, the U.S.-China Education Trust, and F.Y. Chang Foundation, guided by Ambassador Julia Chang Block, President. The League of Arab States, representing 350 million people in 22 member countries. Japan, history, hospitality, and advanced technology. Sharing tomorrow. Tourism Malaysia. The Petrolin Group, expertise with integrity in the fields of oil and gas, exploration and production, energy, and infrastructure. The Rotondaro Family Trust. The Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings. And Ventana Productions, television facilities, editing, and distribution services.